Okay, so a couple things of overview here. There's actually a lot on this slide, but we're going to get to all of it in just a minute. Photosynthesis is a two-step process. The first step is all about light. So we call it the light-dependent reactions because they depend on how much light is present. In the absence of light, none of this will happen. As you increase light, you can actually increase the speed or the rate of the light-dependent reactions. But there is a max. There's only so much sunlight you can put on a plant, and it's doing photosynthesis as fast as it can. So at that point, it wouldn't matter if you kept increasing light intensity. Couple main things to remember. The light reactions are going to be occurring in the thylakoids. So if you remember back from the little previous slide here, the thylakoids are these little stacks that you see here, and they act as antenna. So what they do is they receive light energy. Okay, light is penetrating, hitting the thylakoids, and then a bunch of stuff happens here. The main thing for you to keep in mind is we're not yet building the sugar. What we're going to be building here are two main things. ATP, which I hope you remember is energy, and something called NADPH. You do not need to know what that stands for or its molecular structure or anything. It'll make slight sense as we get to it, but it's what we call an electron carrier. So it just basically attaches these free floating electrons to itself, and it's got an energy source to it, but it's not as important as ATP. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is called light independent, which means that light is not used in this part of the process. And if light is there, fine. If it's not, fine. It doesn't matter. These will occur in the stroma. And the big idea to note is we're going to take all that energy we just produced in the previous, and then we're going to take carbon dioxide, which is one of the things that plants need, and we're actually going to build the glucose. So the main goal here in the light independent reactions is to build the sugar in the cell. All right, so we're going to go through some of the stuff about light first. And as you well know, I'm not a physics teacher, so I'm not going to get into a whole lot of details about light as a form of energy, but you should probably just equate light as a form of energy. And that light travels in wavelengths, and a few things I remember is wavelengths are like that, and sometimes you have short wavelengths, that's terrible, and sometimes you have really long wavelengths. And then what's important for biology is that these cells in photosynthesis can only use a very narrow part of what's called the electromagnetic spectrum, so measurement of energy pretty much. And they've blown it up here to show you where the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, fit on this spectrum. So plants can only use this portion of light, and you can see that it's measured in wavelengths. Particularly the unit is nm, which is called a nanometer, so it's an incredibly small piece of distance there. So we're going to be working within this range of numbers here when we talk about photosynthesis. Some of the numbers are more important than others because some of them help plants a little bit more than others. Okay, so a little bit more about light here. What the light is actually doing is that it is hitting the chloroplast. But the chloroplast itself, if you notice in this picture, they've drawn it in this funky yellow color to show you that chloroplasts actually don't have a color. What is actually appearing green to you is the pigment inside the chloroplast. And if you remember that, you probably remember the word chlorophyll. This is totally not going to fit. And it fits. Nice. So chlorophyll is one of the pigments that you find inside of a chloroplast. There are a few others we'll talk about too. But anyway, so it's the chlorophyll that actually is absorbing the light energy. So that's why these thylakoids are full of chlorophyll. So that's why they appear green, but the chloroplast itself does not. Okay, so you got light coming down onto the chloroplast. Some of the light is going to be absorbed and some of it's going to be reflected. So that's going to be, let me change my color here. That's a terrible choice. Absorb light and then reflected light. Notice the reflected light is this little green arrow here. There's a reason for that, and that also is the reason that explains why plants are green. So some wavelengths of light, when you're being absorbed, it means you're helping photosynthesis, but when you're being reflected, it means that that color is not helpful, and that's why plants just kind of get rid of it. As the pigments absorb the light energy, electrons are boosted and excited. They are boosted at higher energy levels. So you kind of boost up the energy levels within these molecules. And then that creates this like potential energy that's then going to cause some movement within the cell. Sounds confusing because let's face it, it kind of is. But I'll try to simplify it as best I can. I don't like green. Blue. Okay. So other pigments that exist are, well, I mentioned chlorophyll earlier. There's actually two kinds, by the way. Chlorophyll A is the main one. There's mostly chlorophyll A in a plant, but there's also something called chlorophyll B, which is there, but it's just less abundant. We've also got the carotenoids, or carotenoids if you prefer, and these guys are there as well, but you don't notice them. The only time you notice these colors is in the fall, because when plants get the signal from the lack of sunlight that it's time to shut down photosynthesis for winter, the chlorophyll A and B begin to disappear, like they break down, the molecule disintegrates, but the carotenoids don't get the message right away, so they stick around a little longer. So the reason why the leaves change color is because the chlorophyll A and B are disappearing, and then the carotenoids, which were always there, we just never noticed them because there's way too much green, they become apparent. So that's why we see leaves change color in the fall. So it just lets the carotenoids have their time to shine, I guess. The picture you see here is a really common graph that likes to appear on a lot of things. This is an absorption spectrum. Spectrum meaning let's look at all the possible wavelengths and see which ones have which type of absorption. Now this is a messy graph because there's several different pigments on here. Most of the time on a graph in the AP Bio, you would only see the lines for chlorophyll A and B. So we'll focus on those a little bit later. But I just wanted you to see that there's different pigments absorbing and reflecting different colors. So this is absorption. So the higher the line, like right up here, this really high point in chlorophyll B, that means that wavelength, that color is being highly absorbed. And if it's being absorbed, it means it's being used to boost those energy levels in photosynthesis. So that means, for example, if you follow the color down here, blue, chlorophyll B is really good at absorbing the blue wavelength at 450 nanometers. So that means that wavelength is really helpful for photosynthesis. Any color that is not helpful is going to have a very low absorption and therefore is going to be reflected back out into the atmosphere. So if you kind of look in the middle of this graph here, oh, that's an ugly color. Highlight this. Notice this area of the graph has very low absorption. And then notice the color. So it's green. So we don't know the evolution of why it is. So I can't answer that question. I just know that it is. Green really is not absorbed by plants. It's actually reflected more so than not, which is why pretty much every plant you can think of is green in some way. So green is actually useless to plants. It is useless in photosynthesis. You would think it would be the opposite. It's kind of ironic, but it is not absorbed at all, very little, and is therefore going to be reflected. So every other color gives a little bit of a, absorption here and there with different wavelengths, but not green. Green is not so good. P.S. The reason why it benefits plants to have more than one pigment is because you can see the different peaks on this graph. Some pigments will just work at different wavelengths. It's just a way to maximize, how can I maximize the process of photosynthesis? Well, let me just have extra pigments that can absorb at different wavelengths, and then I can absorb as much sunlight energy as I can. Here's another graph in a different way, but same idea. This is a graph of Anacris, the species Anacris, which is a green plant you would put in a fish tank. And this is the action spectrum. So it's showing you the relative rate of photosynthesis. Relative rate meaning these numbers on this y-axis don't really have a meaning. It's just used for comparison. So you know that 7 is greater than 2. So what it's showing you, and it's color-coded, which is kind of nice, is that at between 400 and 450, which is the violet and the blue wavelengths, notice that photosynthesis is really high. Notice that it dips down here with the greens and the introduction of the yellows. And notice that it also has another peak over here with the reds and the late oranges there. So this is showing you that blue light and red light are really good for photosynthesis, but green light is not. So it's just interpreting some data from that particular graph. Okay, Some details here. I wanted to include the equation. Now, I don't think you would ever be asked to write out the equation, certainly not balanced. I mean, I don't want to quote that now. I have no idea what's going to be on this exam anymore, but you should be aware like what goes in and what comes out. So you've got on your left-hand side before the arrow, these are called your reactants. And hopefully you remember from chemistry class that everything to the right of the arrow, these are called your products. Okay, so the idea is every atom that goes in has to come out. Now, I did kind of mess up here because I couldn't type it correctly, but this part here where it says plus light, light is not an atom, so it is not a molecule. It doesn't even belong in the equation. What scientists would actually do is they would like write the word light above the arrow there to show you that light is the catalyst. So in the absence of light, none of this will happen, but when light is there, it does happen. So what do plants need? Plants need water, they need carbon dioxide, and of course light. They produce oxygen, they produce C6H12O6, which is the formula for glucose. That's the same glucose we were talking about. We were talking about controlling blood sugar levels in diabetes. It's the same one. And then, of course, water. All right, so now here's what's weird. Water is both a reactant and a product. Some authors will change that around, and they will not include water as a product, and then they will change this coefficient to 6. It's not really like an essential point of fact to know that. Just be aware that sometimes water is on both sides and sometimes it's not. It's just author preference. Water is conserved a little bit. So like the water molecules can get rearranged and recombined and make more water molecules at the end. The picture here, though, is a really good summary. It explains the 2 steps that are going to happen for photosynthesis. You've got your light reactions, and you've got something called the Calvin cycle. Now, Calvin cycle, when I was called the Calvin cycle up until like I started teaching, and now the Calvin cycle, we call it the light independent. So it's really, of course, in biology we name everything twice. So it's a synonym for the Calvin cycle. Okay, so notice, I want you to keep in mind when are the different ingredients or reactants used. So the first stage in this process includes light and water, and that's it. So light and water are used there. And then notice that oxygen is made, and remember that that's a waste product. And then in the second step, you're going to have CO2. So CO2 doesn't get used until the second step. And then, of course, the sugar is made in the second step as well. Also notice the bridge between everything. You've got those energy sources. ATP is going to be produced in the light reactions along with this thing called NADPH. And then they're going to be used in the Calvin cycle. And then they get reused, hence the cycle idea.